Right now, there is like a $500 piece of plastic and fiberglass just flying over the Red Sea.
Yeah, just cheap wire and off-the-shelf parts, really.
Exactly. And that tiny, cheap piece of plastic is actively forcing multi-billion-dollar global shipping empires to completely redraw the map of the world.
It's pretty wild to think about.
It is. So today, we're looking at how the brutal, unyielding math of modern asymmetric warfare has just completely broken the traditional Western superpower model. And we're unpacking the deep ideological frameworks driving the Middle East toward this, profound, potentially global crisis.
Right, because the diagnostic landscape of global geopolitics right now is just in a state of severe distortion.
Distortion's a good word for it.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at the strategic layout of the Middle East today, the traditional cause and effect mechanisms, the stuff that govern international relations for the last 80 years, they simply no longer apply.
They're gone. And we are going to explore the mechanics of that breakdown today. Our mission for this deep dive is to deconstruct a highly charged, incredibly multifaceted panel discussion that recently took place in the Netherlands.
Which was fascinating to read through.
Oh, absolutely. We're working from a very detailed transcript of this debate. It attempts to tackle the structural geopolitics of the region, the intricacies of U.S.-Iran relations, the history and current reality of the Israel-Palestine conflict, and, well, ultimately, Europe's deteriorating position on the global stage.
And I should say, the source material here is exceptionally dense.
Yeah, it's a lot to get through.
Because it features three highly distinct, fundamentally opposed voices. You have a geopolitics professor offering this macro, structural, academic view of global alliances.
Right, the zoomed-out view.
Exactly. Then you have a journalist who brings deep historical sympathies for the Palestinian cause, and, crucially, a highly supportive analytical framework regarding the Iranian domestic state.
Which you don't hear often in Western media.
You really don't. And balancing that out, you have a data entrepreneur and former member of the Israeli Defense Forces who analyzes the region strictly through a staunch, pro-Israel existential security lens.
So three completely different worldviews clashing in real time.
Exactly. But before we dive into the specific mechanics of their arguments, we
Yeah.
really need to establish the operational framework for this analysis.
Yeah, I think that's crucial.
I want to address you, the listener, directly regarding that framework. This deep dive contains highly polarizing, politically charged viewpoints from both the left and the right regarding the Middle East.
Very charged.
It is a mandatory requirement to state explicitly that we, as your hosts, are not taking sides.
Nope, not at all.
We are not endorsing any of the specific viewpoints, the historical interpretations, or the factual claims made by these panelists. Our sole mandate is to impartially report on the ideas contained in the original source material.
Just laying out the data for you.
Right. Our objective is to dissect the arguments they presented to each other, just to help you understand the wildly diverse, often contradictory perspectives that are currently shaping this geopolitical theater.
So the core question we're trying to answer today is how this region became a structural powder keg, where a single tactical decision can upend the global economy, and, whether any of the theoretical paths to peace actually hold up to intense scrutiny.
It's a huge question.
It is. So let's start with the macro picture. How does the United States factor into this volatile equation? The debate starts with the geopolitics professor basically deconstructing the U.S. strategy regarding Iran.
Specifically focusing on the Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign.
Right. And the professor argues that the underlying premise of this offensive, the idea that decapitating Iranian leadership would just collapse the state, was built on a fundamental fatal illusion.
It was a profound misreading of Iranian state architecture, honestly. The prevailing theory in Washington for a long time was that if you applied enough external pressure, the system would break.
Like by assassinating high-ranking military or political figures.
Exactly, or crippling the economy through sanctions. The thought was that the civilian population would inevitably rise up, topple the government, and clear the way for a Western-friendly regime.
Which sounds logical if you're looking at a different kind of country.
Right. The professor argues that the strategy relied on analyzing Iran through the exact same lens used for regimes like Hosni Mubarak's Egypt or Bashar al-Assad's Syria.
Which he categorizes as mafia states, right?
Yes. The mechanism of a mafia state is entirely centralized around a single strongman and a network of patronage.
Right.
The power structure is inherently fragile because it lacks an ideological foundation. It's held together purely by the distribution of resources and the monopoly on violence.
So if you remove the central figure, the patronage network just fractures.
Exactly. Competing factions turn on each other, and the entire state apparatus crumbles. But, and this is the key point, Iran does not function on that mechanism.
It really doesn't. Iran's structural resilience is built on this complex, deeply entrenched theological and constitutional framework known as velayat-e-faqih.
Which translates to the rule by Islamic jurists.
Right. And this is where Western analysts often just fail to grasp the mechanics of Iranian continuity. Velayat-e-faqih isn't just some religious slogan.
No, it's the absolute operational core of the state.
Yeah. The underlying logic is that if a society is to be governed by divine law, the only logical leader for that society is the person with the most exhaustive, supreme understanding of that law.
Right, so the supreme leader isn't a dictator holding power merely through military force. He is the apex of a massive, heavily bureaucratized theological legal system.
It's highly institutionalized.
Completely. And the professor notes that because of this structure, removing one ayatollah or even a top-tier general, it just doesn't create a vacuum that collapses the state.
Because the institution is explicitly designed to survive the individual.
Exactly. The professor points out that there are over 80 highly qualified clerics within the assembly of experts who are already embedded in the power structure, just waiting to seamlessly take over.
So you're not fighting a single man. You're fighting a constitutional ideology that has engineered its own succession planning down to the microscopic level.
Which led to massive strategic failures regarding internal Iranian politics.
Yeah, the professor highlights the recurring Western expectation that external military or economic pressure will embolden Iranian protesters. But the reality, mechanistically, is the exact opposite.
Because of the rally around the flag effect.
Right.
It's a well-documented psychological and political phenomenon, and it is weaponized perfectly by the Iranian regime. When the U.S. or Israel launches external attacks or applies crippling sanctions, it actively undermines internal democratic movements.
Oh, for sure. The regime instantly gets the narrative capital to brand any domestic protester as a foreign agent or a traitor.
Or a puppet of Western imperialism. It forces a brutal choice on the populace.
Right, because even a citizen who despises the internal oppression of the regime will prioritize national survival when foreign bombs are falling.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The external threat artificially solidifies the regime's legitimacy.
But the miscalculation wasn't just political, right? It was profoundly economic. And this is where the panel shifts to the reality of modern asymmetric warfare, which I found fascinating.
It's where the U.S. military's strategic dominance begins to mathematically unravel.
Yes.
Yeah.
The U.S. objective was to aggressively degrade Iran's military capabilities, but they basically ran into a brick wall in the Red Sea and the Strait of Hormuz.
Because the financial math of power projection has been entirely inverted.
How so?
Well, historically, military dominance was symmetrical. The nation with the largest industrial base could produce the most tanks, the most ships, and therefore control the battle space.
Right, the World War II model.
Exactly. But what we are seeing now is extreme asymmetry, where the cost of offense has plummeted to near zero, while the cost of defense has skyrocketed exponentially.
It's like the geopolitical equivalent of a massive DDoS attack, like a distributed denial of service attack on a computer server.
That is a perfect analogy.
Like, it costs a hacker practically $0 to write a script that sends millions of fake traffic requests to a website. But it costs the server owner millions of dollars in bandwidth and cybersecurity infrastructure to keep the site from crashing under that artificial load.
You basically go bankrupt trying to stop a cheap, infinite offense.
Exactly. And that maps perfectly onto the kinetic reality of drone warfare.
It really does. The professor outlines the literal unit economics discussed on the panel. You have Iranian proxy groups manufacturing loitering munitions, basically attack drones using off-the-shelf commercial parts, fiberglass, and small combustion engines.
Stuff you could almost buy at a hobby shop.
Basically, yeah. These drones take days to assemble and cost a few $1,000s at most. They're entirely disposable.
And to intercept that $5,000 drone, the United States military is forced to fire a Patriot surface-to-air missile or a Standard Missile-2 from a naval destroyer.
And those interceptors cost anywhere from $2 to $5 million apiece.
It's insane math. Furthermore, they take weeks, sometimes months, of highly complex industrial manufacturing to replace. You just cannot win a war of attrition when your defense costs 1,000 times more than your adversary's offense.
You will literally deplete your defense budget and your advanced munitions stockpile against an enemy throwing the equivalent of flying lawnmowers at you.
Flying lawnmowers, right. And this asymmetric economic warfare extends directly into the maritime domain, too. The Strait of Hormuz and the Red Sea are the primary arteries for global hydrocarbons and commercial freight.
And the traditional view was always that you needed a blue water navy, massive aircraft carriers, and guided missile cruisers to control those straits.
But the panel notes that Iran and its proxies realized they don't actually need to sink an aircraft carrier to control the strait.
No, they just need to alter the actuarial tables of maritime insurance companies in London.
Which is brilliant and terrifying. You have these massive oil tankers, which the professor accurately describes as floating, unarmored bombs carrying hundreds of millions of dollars in cargo.
And the mechanism of disruption here is just brilliant in its simplicity. A small, cheap fiberglass speedboat armed with basic explosives or anti-tank guided missiles approaches a tanker.
And they don't even have to sink it.
They don't. The mere threat or a single minor strike immediately spikes the war risk insurance premiums for that shipping route. Very quickly, the risk becomes statistically uninsurable.
And once the cargo is uninsurable, the major shipping conglomerates simply refuse to sail. They reroute their entire fleets around the Cape of Good Hope, adding weeks to the supply chain.
Burning millions in extra fuel and driving up global inflation.
All from a non-state actor utilizing a few $1,000s worth of speedboats and drones. They can effectively blockade a global superpower and freeze global trade. It completely shatters the 20th century definition of military hegemony.
So this section of the debate clearly establishes that from the outside, the West has fundamentally misunderstood both the ideological resilience and the asymmetric economic power of Iran.
Right. But as the panel progresses, they move from the external mechanics to a fiercely contested debate about what Iran actually looks like on the inside.
Which gets very heated. The source material presents two entirely contradictory realities regarding the domestic Iranian state.
Yeah, let's look at those. The journalist on the panel offers a perspective that is, frankly, rarely articulated in mainstream Western discourse. His core argument is that the West intentionally ignores the immense socioeconomic development engineered by the regime over the last 40 years.
He really leans into the structural development metrics. He points back to 1979, the year of the Islamic Revolution, when the country was ruled by the Western-backed Shah.
Right.
The journalist states that despite the wealth concentrated in the urban centers during the Shah's reign, the national literacy rate was hovering at a dismal 30%.
Oh, 30%.
Yeah. The vast majority of the country was largely agrarian, impoverished, and neglected by the central government.
So the mechanism of the revolution, in his view, was not just religious fervor, but an anti-colonial demand for equitable resource distribution.
Exactly. He claims that under the clerics, the literacy rate has skyrocketed to over 90%.
That's a massive jump.
It is. He argues the regime systematically built out essential infrastructure, power grids, clean water systems, sanitation, and paved roads connecting the deeply rural provinces to the modern economy.
So he frames the Islamic Republic not as a regressive theocracy, but as a rapidly developing second world nation that successfully lifted tens of millions of its citizens out of abject poverty.
And consequently, the journalist makes a massive demographic claim regarding regime support.
Right, this part was wild. He acknowledges that the highly educated secular elites in Tehran heavily oppose the government, and he notes that this demographic, many of whom have emigrated, heavily informs the Western media narrative.
Yes. However, he claims that the regime still commands 80 to 90% genuine support among the rural, working class, and provincial populations.
With people who directly benefited from the regime's economic development programs.
Precisely. And this leads him to a highly controversial analysis of the recent, highly publicized anti-government protests.
Yeah, where the West saw peaceful, democratic uprisings brutally suppressed by a tyrannical state. The journalist argues the reality was actually a violent insurgency.
He insists the protests were not universally peaceful. He cites specific instances of mass violence, claiming that dozens of mosques were intentionally burned to the ground by rioters.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, municipal buildings were sacked, and internal security forces were systematically ambushed and executed in the streets.
So, through his lens, the state apparatus was not suppressing a democratic movement. It was utilizing its monopoly on violence to quell a violent internal rebellion and maintain civic order.
Right, so you have this narrative of a post-colonial developing nation defending its hard-won infrastructural gains against internal subversion and external imperialism.
But then the former IDF panelist steps in, and he completely dismisses this entire developmental narrative.
Completely. He views the Iranian state through a purely existential, security-focused lens.
Right. For the IDEA panelists, the internal literacy rates or rural water systems are just entirely irrelevant.
Yeah, he defines the Iranian regime exclusively by its foreign policy architecture and its ideological mandate. He argues that the core tenet of the regime is inherently expansionist.
Describing them as a theocracy actively seeking regional and eventually global domination.
He outlines a sequential ideological targeting mechanism. He argues the regime's stated goal is the complete eradication of the State of Israel as step one.
Okay, and step two.
Step two involves the subjugation or expulsion of Christian populations across the broader Middle East.
Right.
And step three is the projection of Islamic revolutionary power into Europe.
So he views their rhetoric not as political theater for domestic consumption, but as a literal, actionable blueprint for genocide and conquest.
Exactly. And because of this assessment, the IDF panelist fundamentally rejects the concept of diplomacy with Iran.
He doesn't believe in it.
No. When Western analysts look at periods of relative quiet or specific diplomatic agreements like the JCPOA nuclear deal, they see progress. The IDF panelist looks at those exact same events and sees a hudna.
A hudna. We should define that for the listener because it's critical to understand here.
Yeah, it's not a permanent peace treaty. In traditional Islamic jurisprudence, a hudna is a tactical, temporary cessation of hostilities.
Right. The mechanism of a hudna is to buy time when you are at a strategic disadvantage.
He is arguing that Western diplomats constantly mistake tactical pauses for genuine ideological shifts. The regime agrees to a pause, collects sanctions relief, and uses that capital to rearm, embed proxies deeper into neighboring countries, and prepare for the next phase of the conflict.
The ultimate goal of destruction never changes, only the timeline shifts.
And that timeline brings us to the most urgent data point he introduces, the nuclear breakout capacity.
Right, the clock ticking in the background.
He points out that, utilizing the cover of these tactical delays, Iran has successfully enriched and stockpiled approximately 450 kilograms of highly enriched uranium.
And it's securely hidden in deep subterranean facilities, right? Immune to conventional bunker-busting munitions.
Exactly. Now, the mechanism of breakout time is essentially the time it would take for a nation to take its existing stockpile of fissile material and successfully machine it into a functional nuclear warhead.
And the panelist notes that the current breakout time for Iran is estimated at a mere 1 to 2 years.
The clock is rapidly winding down.
Which creates an agonizing strategic dilemma. If you accept the premise that bombing the nuclear sites would not only fail to destroy the deeply buried centrifuges, but would also trigger the rally around the flag effect and unite the population behind the regime, then kinetic military action is highly counterproductive.
Therefore, the IDF panelist argues that the current strategy of extreme economic asphyxiation is the only viable path.
So the goal is to apply such crushing economic sanctions that the state's ability to fund its proxy network and its nuclear program just collapses before that 1 to 2 year window closes.
Reconciling these two views is incredibly difficult for a listener to process. You have one panelist looking at the exact same country and prioritizing the mechanism of internal socioeconomic progress.
And you have the other panelist prioritizing the mechanism of external existential threat and nuclear proliferation.
The facts they cite aren't necessarily mutually exclusive, but the core values they use to weight those facts produce entirely different realities.
And that asymmetric drone math we discussed earlier, where cheap Iranian weapons render expensive Western defense systems economically unsustainable, that completely shatters Israel's traditional defense strategy.
Yeah, you cannot rely on a strategy of deterrence or containment when your adversary has built a ring of heavily armed autonomous proxies directly on your borders.
Which forces a brutal transition into the next major segment of the panel, Israel's strategic shift and the deep psychological burden of trauma.
Yes, the deep dive shifts focus to how the events of October 7th, referred to interchangeably in the text as the March 7th or October 7th, attacks fundamentally rewired the Israeli state apparatus.
The geopolitics professor provides this macro-psychological analysis of this shift. He argues that Israel is currently engaged in a deeply emotional war.
A war whose parameters are being dictated by profound collective societal trauma rather than cold, rational, long-term strategic calculation.
Right. And he uses a very specific historical analogy to explain this mechanism, drawing a direct parallel to the United States' behavior in the immediate aftermath of the September 11th attacks.
Which is a highly illustrative comparison. After 9/11, the American populace and its leadership were gripped by an intense, unprecedented vulnerability and trauma.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that psychological state basically bypassed the traditional mechanisms of cautious geopolitical strategy. It led directly to decisions that are widely viewed in retrospect as disastrously irrational.
Most prominently, the invasion of Iraq, which destabilized the entire region and ultimately empowered Iran, the very adversary the U.S. was trying to contain in the first place.
The professor is suggesting that the trauma of the Hamas attacks has placed the Israeli security establishment into that exact same psychological blind spot.
The urgency to restore deterrence and ensure absolute security is overriding long-term political strategy, leading to maximalist military operations that may severely compromise Israel's long-term diplomatic standing and internal stability.
But while the professor analyzes the psychological drivers, the panel also explores a much more cynical, realpolitik explanation for the mechanics of the current war, focusing heavily on internal Israeli politics.
Oh yeah. There's a highly specific, provocative claim made regarding the timeline of Israel's military escalations.
Right.
The panel discusses the phenomenon where significant, highly escalatory military actions, such as the targeted Israeli airstrike on the Iranian consulate building in Damascus, appear to align suspiciously with the personal legal calendar of the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu.
Right. The context here is that the prime minister has been navigating severe domestic legal jeopardy involving multiple corruption indictments for years.
Years, yeah.
The claim introduced on the panel is that there is a statistical correlation between the dates of these high-stakes military strikes and the dates the prime minister is scheduled to appear in court for preliminary hearings or testimony.
The implication of this claim is just chilling. It suggests that the mechanism driving the expansion of the war is partly tied to the political survival of the executive branch.
Because a nation engaged in an active, multi-front existential war cannot easily replace its leadership or hold complex domestic corruption trials.
Right. By periodically flaring up the conflict at strategic moments, a leader can maintain a perpetual state of emergency, which naturally acts as a shield against domestic legal and political accountability.
But regardless of whether the driving force is national trauma or cynical political survival, the mechanical reality on the ground is that the core military doctrine of the Israeli Defense Forces has undergone a revolutionary shift.
The former IDF panelist details the historical framework versus the current operational reality.
Yes, for decades, the IDF operated under a doctrine informally known within security circles as mowing the lawn.
Mowing the lawn. The mechanism of that is rooted in the assumption of perpetual managed conflict. The Israeli security establishment basically concluded it was functionally impossible to permanently eradicate deeply entrenched proxy armies like Hamas in Gaza or Hezbollah in Lebanon.
Therefore, the strategy was containment. You accept a baseline level of threat.
Right.
When the proxy group accumulates too many rockets or their tunnel infrastructure becomes too advanced, the IDF initiates a targeted, time-limited military operation.
The objective is not total victory. The objective is merely to degrade their capabilities, destroy the weapons caches, assassinate key mid-level commanders, and reestablish a deterrence timeline.
You mow the grass, knowing full well it will grow back over the next 3 to 5 years, at which point you will simply mow it again.
It's a grim, attritional maintenance schedule. But the IDF panelist argues that the trauma and the sheer scale of the recent intelligence failures proved that mowing the lawn is a fatally flawed mechanism.
The threat is no longer viewed as manageable. It is viewed as an acute existential danger. Because of this, the doctrine has officially shifted to finishing the job.
And the mechanics of finishing the job require total, systemic eradication. It requires not just the destruction of weapons caches, but the complete dismantling of the adversary's civilian governing structure.
The total destruction of their military infrastructure and the permanent occupation or demilitarization of the territory.
This doctrine shift explains the unprecedented duration, scale, and destructive intensity of the current military campaigns. It is a transition from border management to absolute unconditional victory.
But this maximalist military approach brings us directly to the journalist's fierce counterargument.
Yes, he looks at the mechanics of finishing the job and does not see existential defense at all. He sees the intentional, systematic application of state cruelty.
He levels a severe condemnation against Israel, utilizing specific administrative and logistical details to argue that it operates as a rogue apartheid state.
And to substantiate the claim of apartheid, the journalist doesn't just rely on rhetoric. He points to the physical and administrative architecture of the West Bank. He cites the existence of approximately 600 roadblocks and military checkpoints laced throughout the territory.
We need to explain how this checkpoint system functions mechanistically for the listener. It is not just about border security. It is about the micromanagement of daily life and economic activity.
Yeah, the journalist describes a dual reality system. You have Palestinian civilians who are subjected to military law, forced to queue for hours at these checkpoints just to travel between neighboring towns for work or medical care.
The unpredictability of the checkpoints paralyzes the Palestinian economy and strips away freedom of movement.
Conversely, he notes that within the exact same geographical territory, you have Israeli settlers living under civil law, utilizing a completely segregated infrastructure network.
Vehicles with Israeli license plates utilize bypass roads that completely circumvent the checkpoint system, allowing seamless travel back and forth into Israel proper.
He also heavily emphasizes the 700-kilometer separation wall. The journalist argues the mechanism of the wall is not purely defensive.
Because the route of the wall deeply penetrates into the West Bank, often cutting Palestinian farmers off from their own agricultural lands or dividing communities in half.
He argues it is an active mechanism of territorial annexation, resource control, and systemic humiliation. He claims that military tactics, such as deliberately targeting the extended families of spiritual or political leaders in airstrikes, prove the state has abandoned international law entirely.
So we have two totally irreconcilable narratives operating simultaneously here.
Yeah.
The IDF perspective argues that total military dominance is the only mechanism for state survival in a hostile region. The journalist perspective argues that this dominance is inherently colonial, oppressive, and structurally illegal.
What I found profoundly insightful is how the geopolitics professor steps back and analyzes how these two clashing mechanisms interact to create a self-perpetuating loop of violence.
It's a tragic cycle. He points out that maximalist military force often achieves the exact opposite of its intended political goal.
He uses the historical trajectory of Hezbollah in Lebanon to illustrate this mechanism perfectly.
Right. There was a period prior to the recent escalations where Hezbollah's domestic political standing within Lebanon was actually quite fragile.
The Lebanese economy was collapsing, and many Lebanese citizens blamed Hezbollah's shadow state and corruption for the crisis. They were losing their mandate.
But the professor points out that when Israel initiated heavy airstrikes and military operations into Lebanese territory to degrade Hezbollah's missile capabilities, they inadvertently handed Hezbollah a massive political lifeline.
Because the mechanism of external threat activated once again. By violating Lebanese sovereignty with military force, Israel allowed Hezbollah to instantly pivot away from its domestic failures and rebrand itself.
They reclaimed the narrative of the resistance. They positioned themselves as the only viable defense force capable of protecting the Lebanese people from Israeli aggression.
The kinetic strikes designed to destroy the enemy ended up politically resurrecting them.
It is the tragic paradox of the region. The harder a state strikes to ensure its absolute security, the more it validates the narratives of its enemies, empowering the very insurgencies that necessitate the security in the first place.
So with the conflict locked into this seemingly inescapable structural loop of violence, the panel is forced to address the ultimate question. How do you physically and politically design a framework to break the loop?
Which brings us to the geography of peace and the intense debate over the 1, 2, and 3-state solutions.
Let's examine the mechanics and the roadblocks of each theoretical solution, starting with the one-state solution. To an observer in London or Washington, a single unified democratic state extending from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, where every citizen has an equal vote regardless of religion or ethnicity, sounds like the most logical, equitable mechanism for peace.
It sounds ideal on paper, yeah. But the professor systematically dismantles it as a demographic and political impossibility.
The primary mechanical roadblock is the Palestinian right of return.
Exactly. If millions of Palestinian refugees and their descendants currently living in camps in Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria were granted citizenship and allowed to return to this new single state, the demographic balance would instantly invert.
The Jewish population would immediately become a minority within the new democratic framework.
Right. And because the foundational ethos of Zionism and the State of Israel is to maintain a sovereign safe haven, where the Jewish people exercise self-determination and majority control over their own destiny. A one-state solution effectively legislates the end of the Jewish state through pure demographic arithmetic.
No Israeli government could ever accept a mechanism that engineers its own sovereign demise.
But the roadblocks to a one-state reality aren't just demographic. They are deeply theological.
Oh, this was fascinating. The panel highlights the perspective of the religious Zionist movement within Israel, which is a highly influential political bloc.
For a secular analyst, land is just a tradable commodity. You can swap a few square miles here for a few square miles there to draw a border.
Sure.
But for religious Zionists, the territory of the West Bank, which they refer to exclusively by its biblical names, Judea and Samaria, is not merely real estate or a security buffer.
The mechanism of their belief system is eschatological. They hold a firm theological conviction that maintaining Jewish sovereignty over Judea and Samaria is a literal, divine prerequisite for the arrival of the Messiah and the redemption of the world.
You cannot apply secular diplomatic mechanisms to theological absolutes.
You really can't. You cannot negotiate a land compromise when the opposing party believes that surrendering that specific territory will actively delay the end of days and violate a covenant with God. The mechanism for compromise simply does not exist in that framework.
So, with the one-state solution structurally unviable, the debate shifts to the two-state solution, which has been the holy grail of international diplomacy for over 70 years.
Right, and the journalist on the panel is a fervent advocate for this framework. He roots his argument in a deep historical timeline. He points out that the mechanism for two states was literally the foundational document of the conflict, the 1947 UN partition plan.
He traces this forward to 1988, highlighting a massive, often underappreciated historical pivot when Yasser Arafat and the PLO formally declared an independent Palestinian state that explicitly acknowledged the 1967 borders, effectively recognizing Israel's right to exist in a two-state paradigm.
And he emphasizes the massive shift in global diplomatic consensus. Today, 158 out of the 193 member states of the United Nations officially recognize Palestine as a sovereign state.
The international legal and diplomatic infrastructure is overwhelmingly primed to execute a two-state reality.
His specific proposal to bypass the current animosity is a two-state confederation. This mechanism envisions two distinct sovereign nations, but operating under a highly integrated, confederated system, perhaps sharing economic zones or security infrastructure that is heavily supervised, funded, and guaranteed by the United Nations.
He acknowledges the trust deficit is so profound that bilateral negotiations are useless. The mechanism must be enforced by a global coalition.
To underscore how close this framework has come to reality, the geopolitics professor brings up a monumental piece of diplomatic history, the 2002 Arab League Peace Initiative.
This is a crucial piece of history to unpack because it highlights the absolute tragedy of timing. In 2002, during the height of the violence of the Second Intifada, the Arab League, spearheaded surprisingly by Saudi Arabia, put forward an unprecedented offer.
The mechanism was straightforward. All 22 member states of the Arab League offered Israel complete normalization of relations, full peace treaties, and integration into the regional economy.
The single condition was that Israel agreed to a two-state solution based on the 1967 borders with a just resolution for their refugees.
It was the ultimate diplomatic prize total regional acceptance handed to Israel on a silver platter.
But the mechanics of failure took over. The initiative was announced at the Beirut summit, but on the exact same day, a devastating suicide bombing occurred at a Passover Seder in Netanya, Israel, killing dozens of civilians.
Just horrific.
The trauma of the bombing instantly obliterated the political viability of the peace offer within Israel. The Israeli government launched a massive military reoccupation of the West Bank in response, and the initiative withered on the vine.
It proves how easily extreme violence can veto structural diplomacy.
Exactly. And because the two-state solution has suffered decades of these structural failures, the former IDF panelist introduces a completely radical, highly controversial alternative mechanism, the three-state solution.
Yes, his proposal requires a complete geopolitical rewinding of the clock. He argues that the international community must entirely abandon the premise of an independent Palestinian state. Instead, he proposes returning to the administrative borders that existed prior to the 1967 war.
The mechanics of this three-state reality are drastic. The Gaza Strip would be formally handed back over to the sovereign control and administration of Egypt. The West Bank would be annexed or handed back to the sovereign control of the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan.
Israel exists between them. You achieve regional stability by utilizing the existing state apparatus of Egypt and Jordan to govern the Palestinian populations.
But the justification he provides for this proposal plunges the panel into an explosive historical debate regarding the very nature of Palestinian national identity.
Yeah, this got really intense. The IDF panelist asserts that a distinct, unified historical Palestinian identity is a modern fabrication.
He argues that the concept of a Palestinian people was essentially a brilliant piece of geopolitical marketing engineered by Yasser Arafat and the PLO in the 1960s.
The mechanism of this marketing was to rebrand a standard territorial dispute between Arab nations and Israel into a righteous indigenous national liberation movement, which naturally garners far more international sympathy.
To support this claim, the panelist points to internal sociological dynamics. He argues that the populations in Gaza and the West Bank do not share a unified national consciousness, but are rather extensions of broader Arab tribal networks.
He cites the intense, often violent, internal tribal and clan conflicts within Gaza as evidence that they operate as a fractured collection of families, closer in identity to Egyptian Sinai tribes or Jordanian clans than to a cohesive nation-state in waiting.
But the journalist vehemently rejects this entire premise, attacking the mechanism of historical erasure.
Oh, he pushes back hard. He dives deep into the historical record to establish the continuity of Palestinian identity. He points out that the terminology is not a 20th century invention.
Right. The words Philistini and Palestina have deep linguistic roots, dating back 3 millennia to the Philistines.
More recently, the Roman Empire officially codified the administrative region as Syria-Palestina after suppressing the Jewish Bar Kokhba revolt.
The journalist also introduces demographic data from the Ottoman Empire era to cement his claim of indigenous continuity.
Yeah, he notes that census records from the late 19th century, before the massive waves of European Zionist immigration began, show that the region was populated by roughly 100,000 Arab Palestinians, both Muslim and Christian, compared to a tiny, continuous Jewish minority of perhaps 2,000 to 5,000 individuals living mostly in the holy cities.
He uses this data to argue that the Palestinian claim to nationhood is rooted in centuries of continuous, demographically dominant habitation of the land.
You know, even if we strip away the debate over ancient Roman nomenclature or Ottoman census data, I struggle deeply with the core mechanism of the three-state proposal.
That's hard to swallow.
You can't just legislate a people out of existence. Once a population of millions has spent three-quarters of a century enduring shared conflict, unifying under a shared flag, and coalescing around a deeply shared historical trauma, that identity is forged in iron.
The mechanism of nationalism has already occurred.
Exactly. You cannot forcibly transfer the administration of the West Bank to Jordan and simply declare to millions of people, congratulations, your identity is erased. You are now Jordanian subjects. The lived experience of the last 70 years renders the three-state solution a political fantasy.
And this localized paralysis, the absolute inability to find a viable mechanism for 1, 2, or 3 states, is the exact reason the conflict is threatening to metastasize into a global war.
Because the local architecture has failed.
Right. And as we transition to the final section of the debate, the geopolitics professor zooms out to examine how the failure of the Middle East is exposing the severe structural vulnerabilities of the West, specifically Europe and the NATO alliance.
This is where the deep dive moves from regional history to massive tectonic shifts in the global order. The professor issues a stark warning regarding the strategic posture of the United States.
While European and Middle Eastern allies still view Washington as the ultimate guarantor of their security, the professor argues that the underlying mechanics of U.S. foreign policy have already pivoted heavily toward the Indo-Pacific.
The U.S. security apparatus has recognized that the existential threat of the 21st century is not a regional conflict in the Levant, but the rise of a peer competitor in China.
To illustrate this mechanical shift, the professor notes the sheer volume of military deployment. While the U.S. maintains bases in Europe and the Middle East, its true center of gravity has shifted eastward, highlighting that there are over 63,000 U.S. military personnel permanently stationed in Japan alone.
The Pentagon is restructuring for a potential Pacific naval war, leaving Europe essentially uncovered.
Because of this strategic pivot, the professor introduces a deeply provocative insight. He argues that for Europe, the mechanism of the NATO alliance has actually become toxic.
Toxic is a severe term for the bedrock of Western security, but his analysis is based on the mechanics of asymmetric risk.
He argues that under recent administrations, specifically highlighting the unpredictability of the Trump era, the United States has adopted a unilateral, often impulsive foreign policy.
The U.S. will initiate massive geopolitical disruptions, assassinating a foreign general, ripping up a multinational nuclear treaty, or triggering trade wars without any prior consultation with its European allies.
The U.S. unilaterally kicks the hornet's nest and then expects the European continent, which is geographically much closer to the fallout, to manage the swarm.
The mechanism of NATO's Article 5, the principle that an attack on one is an attack on all, was designed to deter Soviet aggression. But the professor argues that today, Article 5 acts as a dangerous tether, threatening to drag Europe into a catastrophic, cascading war initiated by the impulsive domestic politics of Washington.
A war in which Europe had absolutely no operational say.
The realization here is that military alliances are not magically bound by the ink on paper treaties, right? They are bound entirely by the domestic political risk the guarantor nation is willing to tolerate.
And right now, the professor argues, the American voters' tolerance for absorbing foreign risk on behalf of Europe is rapidly approaching zero.
He illustrates this collapse of trust with a chilling, hyper-specific thought experiment known as the Norwegian fisherman scenario.
Ah, yes, the Norwegian fisherman scenario. It asks a brutally simple question. Imagine a hypothetical situation where Russian forces cross the border and annex a tiny, geopolitically insignificant fishing village on the remote northern coast of Norway.
Which is a founding NATO member.
Right. According to the strict text of the treaty, the United States is obligated to treat that as an attack on Washington itself and retaliate, potentially triggering a global thermonuclear war with Russia. The professor asked, would an American president actually trade New York or Los Angeles to save a Norwegian fishing village?
And the professor reveals that when he posed this exact scenario to high-ranking Norwegian defense officials, their internal assessment was a resounding no.
They do not genuinely believe the U.S. would honor the mechanism of Article 5 for a minor territorial incursion.
And if the absolute ironclad guarantee of mutual defense is compromised by even a sliver of doubt, then the entire deterrence mechanism of NATO is functionally obsolete. It is a paper tiger.
So, if the U.S. security umbrella is folding, what is the mechanism for European survival? The professor looks to the past to find a structural blueprint for the future. He highlights a tragic missed opportunity from the year 1954.
This is a fascinating, crucial piece of alternate history. In the early 1950s, as the foundational economic treaties that would eventually become the European Union were being drafted, there was a parallel, highly advanced proposal on the table called the European Defense Community, or the Pleven Plan.
The mechanics of the 1954 EDC were revolutionary. It proposed the total integration of the armed forces of West Germany, France, Italy, and the Benelux countries into a single, unified, pan-European military structure.
Complete with a common budget and unified command.
Exactly. It was the blueprint for a true United States of Europe, possessing its own independent mechanism of hard power.
But it failed. And we need to understand the mechanism of that failure. It wasn't stopped by the Soviet Union. It was stopped from within.
The treaty was signed, but when it came time for ratification in 1954, the French National Assembly vetoed it.
The context is vital here. It was only 9 years after the end of World War II. The French populace and politicians, heavily influenced by the nationalist legacy of Charles de Gaulle, were deeply terrified by the prospect of West German rearmament, even within a shared framework.
Furthermore, France was bogged down in a colonial war in Indochina and refused to surrender its sovereign control over its military. Nationalist domestic anxieties fundamentally vetoed collective European security.
And that single veto forced Europe into a position of absolute, permanent reliance on the United States military, leading directly to the toxic vulnerability the professor identifies today. He argues that Europe must aggressively revive the mechanism of the 1954 EDC.
They must build a sovereign, unified European defense capability so they are no longer held hostage to the unpredictable electoral cycles of the United States.
But the professor isn't advocating for isolationism. He suggests that this newly sovereign Europe needs to construct a new global security architecture, replacing the U.S. with a coalition of middle powers.
He specifically identifies nations like Canada, Japan, and Australia.
The unifying mechanism for this new alliance isn't geographical proximity, but shared systemic values. He refers to them as rule of law nations, democracies that still inherently believe in the supremacy of international law, multinational institutions, and a rules-based global order, as opposed to the transactional might makes right approach he sees emanating from the current superpowers.
But we cannot discuss European military independence without addressing the massive, immediate threat on their eastern border.
Right. There is a brutal, high-intensity land war occurring in Europe right now. How does the professor reconcile his desire to essentially decouple from the U.S. with the aggressive reality of Vladimir Putin's Russia?
The professor adopts a highly pragmatic, somewhat contrarian analysis of the Russian military mechanism. Despite the aggressive rhetoric coming from Moscow, he analyzes their actual kinetic capability.
And what does he find?
He points out that the Russian military is currently bogged down in a grueling World War I-style war of attrition in Ukraine. They are taking catastrophic personnel casualties and rapidly burning through decades' worth of armored vehicle stockpiles.
Because their military machine is structurally pinned down and severely degraded by the Ukrainian resistance, the professor calculates that Russia simply lacks the logistical and conventional military capacity to launch a secondary invasion into NATO territory, like Poland or Germany, in the near term.
The immediate conventional threat to Western Europe is lower than the political rhetoric suggests.
However, he draws a deeply insightful distinction regarding the mechanism of Russian geopolitical paranoia. He explains that Moscow views the eastward expansion of Western institutions through two completely different lenses.
This is a nuance entirely missed by most Western commentary. The professor explains that historically, Russia did not view the eastward expansion of the European Union as an existential threat.
The mechanism of the EU is primarily economic integration. In fact, deep economic ties usually make military conflict statistically unthinkable. The EU is viewed largely as a peace project.
But the expansion of NATO triggers a completely different mechanism in the Kremlin. NATO is not an economic bloc. It is fundamentally a hostile military alliance whose explicit foundational purpose was the containment and defeat of Moscow.
Therefore, when NATO incorporates former Soviet states on Russia's borders, the Russian security establishment does not view it as a political choice by a sovereign nation. They view it mechanistically as a direct act of war, a hostile, kinetic encirclement designed to strangle the Russian state.
The professor traces this exact mechanism of paranoia back to what he views as the original sin of the modern geopolitical era, the immediate aftermath of the Cold War.
He argues that when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the victorious Western powers committed a fatal structural error in how they managed the peace.
The historical precedent for sustainable peace, such as the reconstruction of Europe after World War II or the creation of the United Nations, requires building a new, inclusive architecture that integrates the defeated powers into the new system. It gives them a stake in maintaining the peace.
But that didn't happen in the 1990s. The West bypassed the mechanism of integration. The United States simply declared absolute victory, effectively told a humiliated, economically ruined Russia to accept its diminished status, and relentlessly expanded the NATO military alliance eastward into the power vacuum, without ever offering Russia a genuine mechanism to integrate into the new European security architecture.
The absolute arrogance of that unipolar victory planted the seeds for the exact crisis we are navigating today.
The failure to construct an inclusive post-Cold War mechanism left a festering wound of national grievance, economic humiliation, and geopolitical paranoia, a wound that leaders like Vladimir Putin have masterfully weaponized to justify the current violence.
The scale of what we have unpacked today is staggering, really.
It really is. We started by dissecting the flawed mechanisms of U.S. strategy regarding Iran, exposing how the theological architecture of Velayat-e Faqih makes the regime immune to traditional decapitation strikes.
We explored the inverted economics of modern warfare, where a $500 drone operates like a kinetic DDoS attack against multi-million-dollar Western defense grids.
We analyzed the irreconcilable domestic realities of Iran, the tension between a mechanism of socioeconomic infrastructure development and a mechanism of expansionist, nuclear-armed theocracy.
We broke down how national trauma has forced Israeli military doctrine away from the attritional management of mowing the lawn toward a maximalist mechanism of finishing the job, all while critics meticulously detail the administrative architecture of what they claim is an entrenched apartheid state.
We navigated the historical and theological roadblocks paralyzing the 1-, 2-, and 3-state solutions, digging deep into the Ottoman demographic data and the tragic timing of the 2002 Arab League peace initiative.
And finally, we zoomed out to the macro level, revealing a fragile global architecture where the U.S. is pivoting to the Pacific, NATO is fracturing under the weight of unequal risk, and Europe is haunted by its 1954 failure to build a sovereign defense mechanism.
Every single diplomatic or military mechanism deployed in this region over the last 80 years has either failed or actively accelerated the cycle of violence. The historical claims are immovable, and the technological landscape has completely destabilized the traditional balance of power.
As we conclude this intelligence briefing, we want to leave you with one final, deeply provocative structural paradox to analyze. We spent significant time discussing the asymmetric math of drones versus missiles. The panel also briefly touched on the fact that advanced militaries, like Israel and the US, are rushing to deploy high-tech directed energy weapons laser systems to regain a cost-effective defensive advantage.
But analyzing that through a broader philosophical lens reveals a terrifying reality about the future of asymmetric conflict. The mathematical burden of defense is absolute. A state military must be 100% successful on defense, intercepting every single incoming threat every single time to maintain security.
But an insurgency, or a non-state actor utilizing cheap, mass-produced defense, only needs a 1% success rate to cause catastrophic infrastructural and psychological devastation.
The ultimate question you have to ask yourself is this: can advanced technology ever truly provide a permanent mechanism for security when the underlying conflict is driven by immovable theological ideology and centuries of historical trauma?
Or, as the grim reality of the panel suggests, when the mechanisms of diplomacy and technological defense both inevitably fail, are we simply destined to watch the brutal right of the strongest dictate the future map of the world?
Keep analyzing the mechanisms beneath the headlines. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.